Beloved, God is still speaking to us. In these present times, in this generation, God still speaks to men. He has not stopped speaking to men, no. The thing is that, have you been listening to Him? The thing is that, have you been able to recognize His voice? Have you been able to differentiate His voice from strange voices? Bible says in the book of John chapter 10 verse 27 that the sheep hears me. In other words, the sheep is able to differentiate the voice of its shepherd over that of a stranger. Just as a child recognizes the voice of his earthly parents here on earth. In the same way, as a child of God, you are supposed to be able to recognize the voice of your father. You should be able to differentiate his voice from other strange voices. When we talk about voice, it does not mean sounds alone. It does not mean that you hear a voice speaking. God can use different means to speak to you. God can use a handwriting on the wall to speak to you. God can use a donkey to speak to you. He can use a burning bush to speak to you. A lot of people today that have not been able to differentiate the voice of God over that of a stranger. Some have not been listening. Others do not even believe that God can still speak to them, and that is one of the reasons why others have not been able to hear Him. They believe that God only speaks to prophets, only to pastors, only to bishops and reverends, only to apostles, those with titles. No. God speaks to every child. In other words, He speaks to all His children. It is very impossible and it's abnormal for a child not to be able to differentiate the voice of his father from that of a stranger, not to be able to recognize the voice of his father. It is impossible, and it is a difficult case. It is an abnormal case for a child not to know the voice of his father. Have you not seen children? Infants, at the sound of their parents, immediately their reactions changes. Have you been able to hear God? You say you are a believer. You have not believed. Like I said before, God does not only speak to prophets, He speaks to all His children. You just have to believe that God is still speaking to us in this generation. Listen to His voice. Learn to differentiate from the voice of your father with that of a strange man, a strange woman, an outsider. You should know when God is the one speaking. Oh yes. Just as He spoke to others, like I said before, in the past, He can still use the same means to speak to us today. Because of God used a donkey to speak to Mr. A yesterday does not mean that He always used a donkey to speak to us today. No. God used a burning bush to speak to someone does not mean that He will continue using a burning bush to speak to us. No. Because there was a handwriting on the wall does not mean that is where God will keep on speaking to you. He spoke to Joseph in dreams does not mean that He will keep on speaking to us in dreams. It could be in that present situation. It could be in that your condition. God is speaking to you, but you are not the one listening. But you have not been listening. You are the one not listening. In that situation, you had a disappointment. It could be God speaking to you. Have you not seen people that had disappointments? They thought it was a failure. They thought that God left them. It was God speaking to you through that means. He's used that opportunity to communicate to you. You should be able to recognize the voice of your father from today. Differentiate his voice from other voices. Oh yes.